Ben, what are you looking for and or expecting from this virtual summit that could influence your investments?
Predictability is the name of the game here, and structure, right? So the call really needs to lay a set of more predictable ground rules for what is clearly a strategic, competitive dynamic. And just as National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said earlier in this week, critical to establishing that structure is the placement of guardrails to reduce these kind of risks of binary events like Taiwan from jeopardizing not just obviously the economic and political relationship, but global stability. So I think what we're looking for is predictability. What both Chinese and American businesses is a more clear framework for which they are able to operate independently of the political dynamics in this relationship.
Yeah. Now, much of the pressure on Chinese stocks certainly seems to have been a result of so many of the regulatory changes and or potential changes that have taken place over the last year as the government continues to try to promote common prosperity. Are we do you think, at the tail end of those kinds of changes?
I don't think there's necessarily ever going to be an end date to regulatory intervention when it involves items like common prosperity, providing for kind of a harmonious national structure here, and certainly some of the latent regulatory changes needed to catch China up to a lot of the type of regulation that occurs in the West, antitrust or anti-monopoly regulation. So I'm certainly not calling an end to it, but I do think that that those frameworks, again, are being established, the frameworks for Chinese companies to go public in the United States, the types of data, privacy or security that they're going to have to show to domestic regulators here before they go public abroad. And likewise, again, that more predictable matrix of the types of businesses that fall into those key categories that might be subject to regulatory intervention. And I think that's giving people a bit more confidence and structure.
Ben, you keep using the word predictability, and I just want to home in on that a little bit because, we're having this conversation on the same day that China is launching the Beijing Stock Exchange, for example, as well. It doesn't sound like there's necessarily going to be bridge building at this summit tonight. I mean, is the way to think about this that the decoupling continues, but that at least there are guardrails that potentially get put in place?
That's right. And I think, again, guardrails, red lines, channels for communication. I think one of the things that the previous administration lacked with the Chinese was constant dialogue on a day-to-day basis across all different levels of seniority. What we want, at least, is a framework for cooperation. We saw inklings of that coming out of the climate event just a couple days ago, and the joint initiative between the U.S. and Chinese officials, where we're again looking for commonalities, looking for common threats that we can approach jointly. But the challenge for investors like ourselves is just not having a predictable framework for our companies that are Chinese listed in America or our Chinese domiciled and operating companies here to operate under. And those are obviously more domestic driven rather than something that would come out of this framework.
Real quick here, Ben, it does seem that there is some pressure being brought to bear on capital allocators like yourselves. Critics would say you are allocating capital to industries in China that will ultimately compete with, on a national security basis, the U.S. How do you respond?
So I think it's actually largely a situation today that was driven by a lot of the activities of the U.S. administration last time around. So what accelerated this decoupling, what accelerated China's development of domestic supply chains, of domestically built core technologies, was largely the actions cutting off their access to those key inputs from the United States. Ben, we're seeing it now in talent flows. We're seeing it. Yep. So I think it's something that was driven one way.